Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. The Bible is a deeply honest and utterly realistic book. 1 Samuel 27 is messy, it's ambiguous, just like real life, and it points us in one direction. And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. The Bible is a deeply honest and utterly realistic book. If you come to it looking for sentimentality or romantic heroism, you're going to be disappointed. The Bible is about real people. The Bible's about a real God. Real people have real weaknesses as well as strengths, failures as well as successes, defeats as well as triumphs. And the real God, while perfect in every way, deals with those real people, often in ways that they do not find comfortable. And David is one of those real people. As we come to 1 Samuel 27, we can look back and see just how impressive he has been. From his first public moment, that unforgettable day when he faced Goliath, David made a powerful impact on everyone who saw him. In 1 Samuel 18 verse 7, we read, "Saul has struck down his thousands, but David his tens of thousands." He was consistently victorious in battle. He won the love and the trust of many in Israel. And although Saul's jealousy drove him into the wilderness and made him a hunted man, David showed extraordinary restraint, refusing to lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. But the Bible's honesty means that we've also seen glimpses of a darker side. David bitterly regretted cutting off the corner of Saul's robe in that cave. It was a small act, but it really pricked his conscience deeply. And by his own measure, he knew he'd crossed a line. More starkly, his furious outburst against Nabal, his readiness to take vengeance into his own hands, it was wrong. He didn't go through with it, but only because of Abigail, the wise, courageous, prophetic woman whom God used to restrain him. Even so, by the end of chapter 26, we read that righteousness and faithfulness are fitting words to describe David. The young man who first introduced him to Saul was quite right, saying that David is a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, a man of good presence. The Lord is with him. That final phrase, "the Lord is with him," has been proven again and again. The Lord has cared for him. The Lord has protected and strengthened him. And David, when he was at his best, he knew it. And now, as we come to chapter 27, we find something extraordinary happens. Something that proves, again, the Bible's utter realism. Just like the Gospels include the failings of the disciples, even though the disciples were revered by the early Christians, here we see the failings of David, Israel's future king. This episode is included, I think, for one reason, because it happened. And through this, God shows us the truth about the heart of even his greatest servant. In this chapter, David chooses to live under the protection of none other than the Philistines, Israel's sworn enemies. And worse still, to some extent, he collaborates with them. And we need to feel the shock of that. The Philistines were the arch-enemies of Israel, the nation that David was anointed to be ruling. It's astonishing, it's almost unthinkable, that the one who's expected to be Israel's king would ever seek refuge in the camp of such an enemy. And yet, that's precisely what he does. The Bible tells this story not to excuse it, but to expose it, and to show us something vital about human weakness and about divine faithfulness. The chapter gives us a candid window into this strange and troubling period of David's life, and it invites us to ask three questions. Verses 1 to 4, why was David among the Philistines? Verses 5 to 7, how was David treated by the Philistines? And verses 8 to 12, how did David behave while he was among the Philistines? First question, why was David among the Philistines? Verses 1 to 4. Well, at the end of chapter 26, David we left David on a high, on a spiritual high. For the second time, he had spared Saul's life. The broken king had confessed his sin. Saul had said, "I have acted foolishly. I've made a great mistake." And David, clear-eyed, confident, declares that the Lord could be trusted to deliver him from all his troubles. Verse 27 of the previous chapter, of that chapter 26, "As your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of all tribulation." It was a moment of triumph, moral, spiritual, personal. Against all the pressure and all righteousness has prevailed. For the Lord has kept David from blood guilt, both with Saul and with Nabal. Faith has held firm. But faith, as we know, can falter. And as chapter 27 opens, something inside David seems to have changed. Verse 1, David said in his heart, Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand. No comment is made on this by the narrator. We're left to draw our own conclusions, but it is a strange turn. David was right not to trust Saul's promises. Saul's repentance has already proved short-lived, and David knew it would again. But here's the puzzle. Why did David now think Saul's hand would succeed, whereas it had always failed in the past? Well, we've been told in 23 verse 14, Saul sought him every day, but God did not give David into his hand. The Lord had protected David again and again. Does David think that God's protections run out? Has David come to think that God's providence was just luck that must at some stage expire? Has he forgotten the encouragement that he received from his dear friend Jonathan, who said, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you"? Or his own words, while he was in that cave where Saul was so vulnerable, and David said himself, "May the Lord deliver me from your hand." David's words reveal more than strategy here. They're revealing fear. The word perish has appeared in very serious situations in Israel's history before. It's the same word that Samuel used when he was warning Israel, "You shall be swept away," perish. And the same word that David himself used, talking about Saul's fate. He will go down into battle and perish. The appearance of this word here indicates a real change. The confidence of David in chapter 26 seems to be giving way to a real fear, real dread. But more than fear, there seems to be a resignation, almost a surrender. Earlier, David had accused Saul of driving him away from the heritage of the Lord and the presence of the Lord. Yet here he seems to do that very thing himself, saying, "There's nothing better for me." Literally, there is no good for me in the land of Israel. No good? What about the good that the Lord has already promised through Abigail? "All the good that the Lord has spoken concerning you," she said, chapter 25, verse 30. Is David now abandoning God's promise? Is this a Jonah-like flight from the Lord's presence? Has despair drowned out his faith? And why choose the Philistines of all people? The last time he fled to Gath, he barely escaped with his own life, pretending madness and drooling on gateposts. Why would he go back there? After all that David has seen of the Lord's deliverance, it seems incredible that he should say in his heart, "There is nothing better for me than to flee." Yet this is exactly how the Bible speaks of us in our own weakness, isn't it? It shows us that even the godliest of us can be overcome by fear, even after our greatest victories. Like Elijah after Mount Carmel, David collapses under the weight of exhaustion and despair. And notice, friends, the Bible does not hide it. It records it, and it records it for our comfort, to show that God's faithfulness does not depend on our strength. God's faithfulness does not depend on our faith. In verses 2 and 3, we move to David's action. His thoughts quickly become deeds. David arises, verse 2, and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. That phrase, went over, it's quite a stinging phrase. He crossed not only the border of the countries, but he crossed a line. David went over to the other side. This is not a quick secret visit like he did before. No, this time he comes openly, with his 600 men and all of their households. Look at verse 3. David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. Now that's a lot of people. It probably adds up to about 2,000 or 3,000 with all of the families added in together, and they lived with Achish, we're told. That is, they lived under his rule. David, God's anointed one, and his army have become vassals of the Philistine king. Now notice the irony of this with me. Gath, the hometown of Goliath, now becomes David's refuge, and Achish, who had once distrusted David, seems to be glad to have him. Perhaps the word has reached Gath of Saul's madness, his slaughter at Nob, the endless pursuit of David in the wilderness. If Saul was now David's enemy, then to Achish, David was an ally. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So David and his people find safety in the most unlikely place imaginable, safety brought at the price, maybe, of compromise. Well, in verse 4 we read of David's success, because the plan works. Verse 4, and when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. After years of running away from Ramah to Gibeah, from En-gedi to Ziph, the pursuit's finally over. David seems to be safe. But what kind of safety has he got? Did you notice the absence of something? The absence of someone? Did you notice there is no mention of the Lord here? Not of his protection. There's no altar. I mean, how can there be? He's not near the tabernacle. David is living in a city of pagan gods. David's scheme, it seems to have succeeded, but on whose terms? Back in chapter 25, David was warned by Abigail, "The Lord has restrained you from saving with your own hand." But here there is no clear word about whether David is doing something in obedience or disobedience. We're getting only ambiguity here, but maybe little hints that he's not doing the right thing. The narrator has answered the first question, however. Why was David among the Philistines? And the answer is, well, he's escaping from Saul. And so we get to the next question. How was David treated by the Philistines? Verses 5 to 7. Anyone who heard that David had gone over to live with the Philistines might naturally ask, well, how is he treated? Surely the Philistines, Israel's sworn enemies, would not embrace the one who killed their greatest champion. And yet the disturbing truth is that David was received with surprising warmth. The enemies of God's people treat the Lord's anointed with generosity. Verse 5, we get a request from David. David said to Achish, "If I found favour in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of the country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" It's a pretty bold request. It's actually a troubling one. David assumes that he has found favour in Achish's eyes. Once that phrase had described David's relationship with Saul. In chapter 16, Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armour-bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favour in my sight." Now the same words describe David's relationship with the Philistine king. Once he was Saul's favoured servant, and now he calls himself your servant to Achish. The man who one day will rule Israel is presenting himself as a loyal vassal of Israel's great enemy. Now we can imagine how much that story might play back home. Did you hear? David, the giant slayer, is now serving the Philistines in the city of the giant. On the face of it, it looks like betrayal. It looks like the act of a traitor. The friend of Israel's enemy must surely be Israel's enemy. And yet David's request is also practical. His following has grown, 600 men plus their wives and children. Gath, that city, it can't easily house a travelling army with livestock and baggage. And so David asks for land of his own. His service to Achish, he implies, deserves some reward. A royal land grant would be reasonable compensation. Still the words catch in our throat, your servant. That's not what we expect to hear from the anointed king of Israel speaking to a Philistine. How can the Lord's chosen one bend the knee to the king of Gath? How will David ever live this down? And again, the narrator offers no defence, no excuse, only the plain report of what happened. Scripture is honest enough to let the tension stand. Verses 6 and 7, we read of David's success. So that day Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And the number of the days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. Achish grants the request immediately. That very day, David is given the town of his own, Ziklag. We don't really know where Ziklag was. It's probably about 25 miles south of Gath, near the border between Philistine and Judean country. It is a strategic gift. It's close enough for Achish to claim authority, but far enough away for David to be able to operate independently. I'm not told if David had any say in the offer, but Achish's gift confirms one thing. David had indeed found favour with the king of the Philistines. But what a scandal that must have caused in Israel. That David, Israel's hero, has received a land grant from the Philistine monarch. I'm guessing the rumour mill might have been running pretty hot. So that's what's become of him. That man who fought for Israel now lives off Philistine generosity. How could this man ever be king of Israel? And yet, the writer puts in a striking detail to verse 6. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. Now that's more than just a note of historical trivia. It's a theological point. By the time the narrator is writing this account, the land Achish thought he was giving away to secure David's loyalty has actually become part of the inheritance of Judah. In trying to control David, the Philistine king is unwittingly advancing God's purposes. The generosity of Achish turns out to be the providence of God. Still, the story is raising painful questions. How would David explain this later on? How could he ever stand before Israel as their rightful king when the record showed that once he had been calling himself your servant to the Philistine ruler? And again, the narrator offers no defence, only the bare facts. For 16 months, David lived in the land of the Philistines. Well, not a long time, but long enough for us to wonder what David was doing in that time. Well, that's our third question. How did David behave when he was among the Philistines? Verses 8 to 12. Now, rumours may have spread that David has turned against his own people, and if so, his reputation would have been ruined beyond repair. The narrator therefore gives us a brief but striking account of his activity, a story that actually doesn't resolve things very much. It ends up being just as unsettling as it is revealing. We find of David's battles in verses 8 and 9. From this new base, David does what he does best. He fights. David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites and Girzites and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. The Geshurites and Girzites were local tribes along the southern border. The Amalekites were Israel's ancient foes. the very people that Saul had failed to destroy back in chapter 15. Notice, though, whom David does not attack. He leaves the Philistines alone. He raids target people who were also the enemies of the Philistines. In Achish's eyes, this would have made David the perfect servant. Every strike looks like royal service. And yet the narrator points us toward another layer of meaning. See how the tribes are described in verse 8. They are described as the inhabitants of the land from of old. That phrasing echoes the language of Moses, who commanded Israel to drive out the nations who had lived in that land, and in the words that we find in Numbers and in Deuteronomy, that they should devote them to complete destruction. So is David, beneath the surface, still fighting the battles of the Lord? Is he fulfilling what Saul has failed to do? Well, the writer is hinting at the possibility of this, but refuses to say it outright, and I think that is a deliberate ambiguity. Despite that ambiguity, however, David's methods are ruthless. Verse 9, and David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments, and come back to Achish. Notice here that David is dealing with these groups of people that God had commanded Saul to deal with, like the Amalekites, but he took away the animals, doing the very thing that Saul had been forbidden to do. Is David just another Saul? It doesn't seem that David has received any explicit word from God concerning this action, as Saul had done with regard to the Amalekites. It is possible that David believed he was acting according to the command that had been given through Moses concerning the original inhabitants of the land, but the writer doesn't make it clear to us. And now we move on, and we find that David returns from his raids, and Achish asks, "Where have you made your raid today?" And David replies, "Against the Negeb of Judah," or against the Negeb of the Jehamelites, against the Negeb of the Kenites. That's what he says in verse 10. In other words, he lies. David deliberately gives the impression that he's been attacking his own people, the Israelites, the people of Judah, the inhabitants of the land that God had given. And the next verse actually exposes what David's thinking is as he's doing this. Verse 11, and David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking lest they should tell about us and say, so David has done. The reason David is wiping out whole populations is actually so that there are no witnesses, no leaks, no one who can tell the truth about what he's doing to Achish and then expose him. His total destruction of the villages is not driven by military efficiency, it's actually driven by fear that his double life is going to be uncovered. The narrator even uses the word custom to describe this policy of David. That word custom was used earlier in 1 Samuel and translated justice, the way that a leader governs his people. Eli's sons had their justice. Samuel's sons had their justice. The kings of the nations have their justice. And here we are told that David's justice, what it looks like in a Philistine country. And the question that is on our minds must be, is David's justice, is his custom good or is it bad? It's a bit hard to tell. It's consistently ambiguous in this account. But we find that his actions are successful. Verse 12, and Achish trusted David, thinking, he has made himself an utter stench to his people Israel. Therefore he, David, shall always be my servant. See, it works. Achish believes every word. Achish believed in David in the same way as Israel believed in the Lord after the Red Sea. The Philistine king places his faith in the Lord's anointed, not in truth, but in lies. He believed that David had become to the Israelites as the Israelites had previously been to the Philistines, a stench. This chapter has shown David to be full of political cunning and cleverness. The killer of Goliath, along with countless other Philistines, finds refuge among the Philistine kings and gets a land grant from him and deceives him into fully trusting him. Perhaps that was David's plan all along, and if it was, he truly is a remarkably cunning and clever man. But the story isn't finished, and the consequences of Achish's trust in David is going to be shown a grave mistake for Achish. But for now, let's pause and consider what we've seen in this chapter. It's worth remembering that Saul said of David back in chapter 23, it is told me that he is very cunning. This chapter has certainly shown that that is true. But 1 Samuel 27 is written so that its contents should puzzle and even shock us. The cleverness of David in this chapter is very different from the righteousness and faithfulness that we'd seen of David in chapter 26. His cleverness includes thinking in the first verses things that appear to express a loss of confidence in God. His going over to Achish may not have been the action of a traitor like it might have appeared, but I'm not sure that you would call it an act of courageous faithfulness. David's ruthless treatment of the peoples he chose to strike were effective, but possibly justifiable in terms that God revealed in his purposes elsewhere. But I'm not sure that we can say that those purposes were really David's motive. It seems that really what he was doing was making a cover for his lies to Achish. Those lies to Israel's great enemy worked. Any doubt Achish had of David's loyalty was certainly set aside by them. But the real impact of this chapter is the introduction of something that becomes more clear as we follow on in the story of David. David, as brilliantly gifted as he was also a man with a nature like ours. Just like us, he was capable of doubting God. Just like us, he was capable of giving way to fear and of self-protective action with no reference to God. If we understand this chapter properly, the disturbing conclusion is that David has all the weaknesses that have led to the downfall of King Saul. The chapter sets out a contrast to the previous chapter, chapter 26, that we looked at last week. In chapter 26, we had David's weaknesses and vulnerability, but also his righteousness and his faithfulness. In this chapter, we have David's strength and success, which is matched by his cunning and cleverness. The sad truth is that the brilliantly gifted David eventually fails because of his unrighteousness and his unfaithfulness. The record of that failure becomes clearest from 2 Samuel chapter 11 onwards. The seeds of that failure, however, are seen right here in chapter 27. We can see that Achish was a fool to put his trust in David. He'd been duped by David's lies and his ruthlessness. But that's something that we should learn from, because the gospel calls us to put our trust in someone who is better than David, great David's greater son, to put our trust in Jesus, in whom is not found any deception or lie, but is only found truth and life. There are no lies with him, no ruthless cunning, just righteousness and faithfulness. It's so good to know that God knows what we are doing even while we are busy failing. The inconsistency of David shows us honestly what even the best of God's people look like. Yes, we can display faithfulness, we can display righteousness, and we may even get better as God works in us by his Spirit and by his word, but we also fail just like everyone else. And as a believer in your workplace, you will work differently to your colleagues at times, and hopefully increasingly so, but there will be times where you will work according to the principles of this world rather than the principles of God's great kingdom. You will not always honour him as you should. And a chapter like this reminds us that we are not the saviour of the world any more than David was capable of being the true saviour. While we want our colleagues to see us as faithful and righteous, ultimately we don't want them to be looking at us. We want them to be looking at Jesus. And I think that is a great application of this account in 1 Samuel and perhaps its core purpose. The raw and honest account of the life that we recognise, a leader like David, that we recognise qualities in that we also find in ourselves, who had qualities that are not as good as we hope they should be. Well, we and they need someone better than us for salvation. And so in our evangelism, and as I do my preaching, we mustn't be the hero of the stories we tell. No, that place belongs to Christ alone. bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks.